In the town of Millbrook, where the rivers run slow and the winters run long, there was a watchmaker named Ambrose Whitlock. He kept a narrow shop on Corbin Street, its window lined with clocks that never quite agreed on the hour, and above the door hung a bell that had rung the same tired note since 1951. Ambrose was not a man people noticed. He wore the same grey cardigan through 3 decades of winters, ate the same lunch of bread and cheese at the same hour every day, and spoke only when spoken to. His hands, though, were extraordinary. He could take apart a broken pocket watch and lay its 100 pieces across a velvet cloth like a surgeon preparing for an operation, and an hour later hand it back to its owner ticking as though it had never known a single lost second. He had learned the trade from his father, who had learned it from a Swiss immigrant who settled in Millbrook after the war. By the time Ambrose took over the shop in 1958, at the age of 24, the town already trusted the name Whitlock, the way it trusted the changing of the seasons. His father had died young, at 51, of a heart that simply gave out one October morning while winding the shop's grandfather clock. Ambrose had been 22 at the time, still finishing his apprenticeship in the back room, and he inherited both the shop and a modest debt his father had carried for years without complaint. It took him 2 full years of careful, unglamorous work to clear that debt, a fact he never mentioned to anyone, not even Walter, until many years later. Perhaps it was those 2 lean years that taught him how to live on very little without feeling poor, a skill that would matter more than he could have guessed. The shop itself smelled of oil and brass polish, and the walls ticked with the sound of 40 clocks, all keeping slightly different time, a small chaos that Ambrose found more soothing than any silence. Customers said stepping through his door felt like stepping backward 100 years, and Ambrose never once tried to modernize it. Not the counter, not the gas lamp he kept for evenings when the power in Millbrook flickered, not even the register, which he ran until it finally broke in 1996 and had to be replaced with a newer, though still ancient, model. What the town did not know was that Ambrose kept a second ledger, one that had nothing to do with watches. It began in the spring of 1961, when a customer, a retired schoolteacher named Mrs. Calloway, came in to have her late husband's watch repaired. While Ambrose worked at his bench, she spoke about her husband's modest pension and how he had spent 30 years putting a little aside into what she called the whole market, not any one piece of it. She mentioned a fund, one that simply held a slice of the largest companies. Ambrose said nothing that day, as was his habit. But that evening, after he closed the shop and swept the floor of watch dust, he sat at his kitchen table and wrote the name of that fund on a scrap of paper. The following week, he walked to the bank on Fenwick Avenue and opened an account with $60, all he could spare after the month's expenses. It was such a small sum that the teller almost didn't bother writing a receipt. He in the country and asked for nothing clever in return. He added to it every month after that. $10 here, $20 there, always after the rent and the shop's small debts were paid. He never spoke of it, not to his customers, not to his neighbors, not even, in the early years, to himself in any serious way. It was simply a habit. The way winding a watch each morning is a habit, done without ceremony, because the alternative, letting it stop, was unthinkable. The 1970s were unkind to Millbrook and unkind to the market alike. In 1973 and again in 1974, the newspapers spoke of a crash that erased more than 1/3 of everything invested in stocks. Ambrose read the headlines at the counter of the diner on Elm Street, folded the paper closed, and walked back to his shop. He did not sell. He did not call the bank in a panic. He simply kept adding what little he could, the way he might keep adding oil to a clock's gears, even as the whole mechanism seemed, to an outsider, to be grinding to a halt. Every clock has a moment where it looks broken, he told a young apprentice once, the only time anyone recalled him offering anything like a philosophy. Most of the time, it isn't broken, it's just between ticks. The apprentice, a boy named Walter Higgs, didn't understand the comment then. He would understand it much later. Those years were hard on Millbrook in other ways too. The mill on the edge of town, which had employed nearly 1/3 of the working men, cut its shifts twice during the decade, and more than one family packed up and left for the cities, hoping for steadier wages. Ambrose watched customers grow thinner and their watches grow older, repaired again and again rather than replaced, and he lowered his prices more than once without telling anyone he'd done it, simply writing a smaller number on the ticket than the job was worth. He never spoke of these kindnesses, and most of the people who received them never fully realized what he'd done for them. Through the 1980s, the shop stayed exactly as it had always been. Ambrose repaired watches for farmers and school teachers, and the mayor's wife charged fair prices and turned no one away who could not pay, often fixing a widow's clock for nothing more than a cup of coffee and a conversation. Behind the counter, his account grew slowly, almost invisibly, the way a tree adds a ring each year without appearing to change at all. Then came October of 1987, when the market fell more than 20% in a single day. A collapse so sudden that grown men were seen weeping outside the bank in the county seat. Ambrose heard about it on the radio while cleaning a mantel clock for the church. He turned the volume down, not up, and kept working. That month, as always, he made his deposit. The 1990s were kinder, and Ambrose's shop even saw a small boom of its own, as antique clocks came back into fashion and collectors from the city began driving out to Millbrook for his repairs. He raised his prices only slightly, added a little more to the account each month, and otherwise lived exactly as he always had. By the year 2000, Ambrose was 66 years old, still opening the shop every morning at 7, still eating bread and cheese at noon. The dot-com collapse that followed wiped out fortunes across the country, built on companies that had never earned $1 of profit. Ambrose's own holdings, invested in nothing more exotic than a broad slice of the entire market, fell too, by nearly half at their worst point. He read about it, said nothing, and kept his hands steady over the watches on his bench. He never once looked at the balance more than once a year, on the first morning of January, a habit he had settled into decades before. It was, he said to Walter Higgs, who had by then taken over most of the shop's daily repairs, like checking on bread while it's rising. Open the oven too many times and you let out the heat. The 2008 financial crisis arrived when Ambrose was 74. Banks the size of small nations seemed to buckle overnight, and neighbors who had never spoken a word about money suddenly spoke of little else, trading rumors of ruin over coffee at the diner. Ambrose closed the shop as usual at 5, walked home along Corbin Street, and made his customary deposit at the end of the month exactly as he had for nearly 50 years. He did not know, and would likely not have cared, that the fund he'd trusted since 1961 would recover every dollar lost within a few years and go on to multiply many times beyond it. Walter Higgs eventually bought the shop from Ambrose in 2011, though Ambrose kept coming in most mornings anyway, unable to fully let go of the bench where he'd spent 60 years of his life. He grew thinner in his final decade, his hands less steady, though his eyes behind his spectacles remained sharp enough to spot a hairline crack in a watch crystal from across the room. Ambrose Whitlock died in his sleep in the spring of 2019 at the age of 85. Millbrook held a modest funeral at the church he had quietly repaired dozens of clocks for over the decades, and perhaps 40 people attended, mostly old customers and Walter, who wept more than anyone expected he might for a man who had never been anything but reserved with him. It was Walter, executor of a will nobody had thought to question, who drove to the bank on Fenwick Avenue with the paperwork Ambrose had left behind in a tin box under his workbench. The bank officer, a young man who had never met Ambrose, pulled up the account and sat in silence for a long moment before turning the screen around. The account that had begun with $60 in the spring of 1961, fed by decades of 10 and 20, and in later years $200 and $300 deposits, had grown to just over $4,100,000. Walter sat outside the bank in his truck for nearly an hour before he could bring himself to drive back to the shop. Ambrose's will, 3 sparse paragraphs in his own careful handwriting, left the entirety of the account to the Millbrook Public Library, with one instruction attached. The money was to fund a scholarship in perpetuity for any young person in town who wished to learn a trade with their hands, watchmaking or otherwise, so that they might have, as he wrote, something honest to build, and the patience to build it slowly. He library board, astonished, voted to name the fund the Whitlock Trade Scholarship, and framed a photograph of Ambrose behind the checkout desk, the only known photograph of him that existed. It has since sent 11 young people from Millbrook through apprenticeships in watchmaking, woodworking, and metalsmithing, none of whom, when they accepted the funds, had ever exchanged more than a few words with the quiet man in the grey cardigan who made it possible. Walter kept the shop open. On slow afternoons, he sometimes takes out the same scrap of paper Ambrose once wrote the fund's name on, now yellowed and soft at the folds, and thinks about the $60 that started it all. He tells the story now to his own apprentice, a girl named Rosa, who asked him once how a watchmaker on Corbin Street could possibly have died with $4 million to his name. Walter only smiled and picked up an old watch from the bench, turning it over in his hands. He didn't get rich fixing watches, Walter told her. He got rich the same way a watch keeps good time, not by moving fast, by never stopping. Osa didn't fully understand it then, but months later, opening her own small account with the first money she'd saved from her apprentice wages, she thought she finally did. She chose a fund much like the one Ambrose had chosen all those decades before, on the advice of a school teacher's widow who had wanted every clock in Millbrook still keeps its time the way Ambrose taught it to. Steadily, patiently, between ticks that no one thinks to notice, until decades later someone finally does nothing in return, but that someone, somewhere, might listen.